So this afternoon, Curtis Jones, who's at the University of Maryland, is going to give the seminar this afternoon. And the title of his talk is Nitrogen Recommendation Methods, Sensor versus Model-Based Comparison. So Curtis, the screen is all yours.
Great, thanks, Chuck. Is that showing up all right for everybody?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess these are fairly informal, and this is a work in progress, so please feel free to interrupt at any point with questions or suggestions. But yeah, this was, I mean, this was kind of Dayton's idea from the last set of meetings. And basically, he was curious about, looking at these nitrogen-rich strips, which were developed by Bill Ron at Oklahoma State. I think going back to the mid to early 90s. And basic idea, I guess there's, prior to that, there were sort of noticed relationships between passive NVVI sensing and crop biomass. And they were sort of noticing high variability, statistical significances down to, sub 1 meter distances. So using the enriched strips, they could sort of assimilate some of that variability and essentially could install a series of strips in a farmer's plot, so they could compare sort of like the implemented practice with a non-nitrogen limiting strip, where you would essentially just put a high dose of nitrogen, so you would know that that would not be a limiting factor in those locations. And the sensing during the mid-season would allow you to have an estimate of the yield expectation, which you could then derive like a fertility rate estimation. And yeah, it seemed to be pretty successful. Noted improvements in fertilizer use efficiency of around 15% compared to traditional techniques. And this is just sort of a plot from, I think, the 05 Ron publication, meant to put it on there. But yeah, just seeing across a bunch of sites in the late 90s and early 2000s, this is sort of a unitless in-season estimated yield factor, which they use to drive. Those are sort of like the in-season predictions that are then converted, but just here showing pretty good correlations across sites and across a few different years of interest. Yeah, we're sort of curious if we would be able to match, that type of predictiveness. So as a test case, mostly just out of convenience, the Lahoma site the site in Oklahoma, it's a long-term fertility experiment, so sort of suitable for the application here. All sort of generously available on university web page. You can get the yield records dating back to 1971. They're running a fertility experiment. There's more treatments than just this, but we were interested in fixing everything else and looking at the nitrogen rate responses from 0 to 100 pounds of N per acre. And yes, it's grain-fed continuous wheat. So pretty nice data set. And I guess, yeah, that's also included. So like the estimations, sort of like a shared spreadsheet with sort of the enriched strips implemented in the context of that experiment. So from a model perspective, sort of doing standard data sets infrastructure. So basically Surgo for soils. There's sort of like an integrated product that is supposed to be a little bit better, but for like most areas, it's essentially Surgo. And looking at some different weather products, we're using the GridMet weather data set, which is a fusion of Prism and NLDOS. So these are all just sort of grid or survey data sets for weather and soil, and also through the solar radiation from DayMet on top because of known biases in the NLDOS solar radiation data. Also, with the fertility experiments, getting the zero fertility rates are actually kind of harder because you're like relying on those soil fertility characteristics more heavily, and mineralization becomes quite key. So there's sort of this plot from Nendel 2019 looking at sort of mineralization potential of soils in different locations across the globe. And so sort of put in sort of experimenting a little bit with NCSS for deriving some of the mineralization rates, translating that into a model for looking at more like 0N or low N application modeling. And I guess sort of back-end stuff, I've been sort of building out model infrastructure. So this was like a test case for applying this, and in terms of just being able to run the model under sort of like a simple API. So hopefully that'll help ease of use and organization of development, and to bring new people in, or anybody who's interested in doing Epic or Apex modeling. I think it'll make it a little bit easier to share if that's of interest to anybody. Yeah, so overall, actually looking at, this is not going back all the way to 1971. Mostly the gridded weather data sets we have go back to 1981 and need a little bit of spin up period. So made that about 10 years. So anyways, still about a 30-year record of yields, which is pretty nice. And can see overall tracking the responsiveness in terms of yield, across the N rates at the Lahoma site. A little bit of exaggerated variability compared to the observations. But sort of, I don't know, some of that could be explained by sort of averaging of replicates as opposed to simulating sort of overall averages. Now the N-rich strip modeling itself, essentially the sensing dates occur during the spring, I guess, like or mid-February to mid-April. Essentially they track the it's sort of like weeks 4 to 6 stage of wheat, and there's also like a climatological parameter in there where they're tracking growing degree days from planting to sensing. Don't really need to worry too much about that, but essentially from a modeling perspective, we're running historical weather back, for the historic record and management until the date of sensing, and then projecting it out stochastically from the sensing to harvest that season. And this was conducted from 1999 onward, so we have data from 99 to 2018. So this this giant plot is showing all those years from 99 to 2018, but kind of just zooming in so you can actually see what's going on. Here's, I've kind of cut off the rates, but these are the different treatments. So this would be 0, 0, 22, 45, 66, 88, and added on sort of like a spring application just out of interest, but ends up being a little bit of responsiveness, although a lot of times the model wasn't too sensitive, I think, especially when the sensing dates were later in the year. But you can see some, depending on the year, some had like high responsiveness to fertility, some had low responsiveness to fertility. And you can kind of translate this into like a nitrogen recommendation where you stop seeing responsiveness, which could occur at different points depending on the behavior. So sort of looking at this more directly in terms of the question posed, in terms of the in-season yield predictions, actually, the enriched strips do better. Those are the blue dots here. The gray dots, the sort of one-to-one line. But the model simulations are done reasonably well, and actually, like the trend lines are almost perfectly overlapping. But in terms of the fertilizer predictions, the model really deteriorates. So there's a lot of noise. Interestingly, the biases are similar in terms of the yields. And then you see it actually a similar bias for the enriched strips, but that doesn't end up getting tracked with the model. So essentially, the in-season predictions of yields are reasonable with the model, but sort of like the allocation of what's driving that seems to be off quite a bit. And sort of gone through exercises in the past, sort of highlighting here like what's most influential in terms of yield prediction with the model, and sort of have like a lot of factors interacting. And obviously, in this context, we have we're interested in yield potential. We're interested in different stressors. Main ones being moisture, carbon, like soil fertility, which would focus in on your carbon nitrogen cycling related parameters, and it's a water focused project, and that's obviously hugely important to yield potentials in general and from year to year. And so underlying is obviously sort of hitting in terms of yield potential, but the allocation of how that's being determined seems to be a bit off. And I think sort of always go back, like under ideal conditions, like your sort of standard process for calibrating a model would be, first to calibrate crop parameters under potential production, so no stressors. That's hard to isolate with temperature outside of controlled experiments that have their own limitations. But essentially, in the past, we did that with a data set that Romulo shared, and we can track the potential yields pretty well. But once we get into limited production, you kind of want to focus on one stress at a time before you integrate multiple stressors together. But that's always a hard ask. but I do think like sort of always an ask for more data. Given these constraints, it's sort of a like an equifinality issue. If you have more, if you can constrain like the model in more dimensions, then you can be sure that you're getting more sure that you're getting outcomes, reasonable outcomes for reasonable reasons as opposed to unreasonable reasons. So I think there could be a need in terms of narrowing down how we're looking at it. There, yeah, I guess other wishes would be to sort of integrate some remote sensing products into this. We're looking at sort of like a on the ground remote sensing product as a point of comparison to the model. The difficulty is application for plot scale. So I think doing that for like this experiment in particular wouldn't be possible. But I do think it's possible to develop a product that could integrate that moving forward. Yeah, that's pretty much it. I don't know